damning report from the chairman of the cross-party Public Accounts Committee. Dame Meg Hillier has told that Whitehall must do better by the taxpayer. In the annual report, it was highlighted that fraud against the taxpayer has spiralled from £5.5 billion in 2018-20 to £21 billion in the past 2 years, warning that Whitehall does not understand risk well enough and is too often clinging to failing projects with optimism bias partly to blame for the latter. Singling out the Department of Health and Social Care, the committee noted that an extraordinary £14.9 billion in waste had been accrued in purchasing personal protective equipment and other spending relating to the COVID response. Drawing on other sectors, Hillier argued the blob must foster a culture similar to that in the technology industry, failing faster and learning from its mistakes. The report also insisted that the government must become better at dealing with uncertainty and accept there is always unpredictability, citing the military mantra that no plan survives the battle, but never go into battle without a plan. I'm joined now by Investigations Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, Elliot Keck. Elliot, isn't this something that governments always need to get better at? And there is a conflict between the political embarrassment of admitting that your project is wrong and the economic reality that you need to do something else. And the sunk cost fallacy is at the heart of this.
Well, a lot of research has been done into this, and what it's shown is that the public sector, and particularly the political element of the public sector, has a particular problem with the sunk cost fallacy. And one of the reasons for that is when embarking on these projects that are seen as politically sensitive or politically important, some of the estimates that are used to justify it are just completely absurd, so that when they are overrun massively or when the business case is proven to not be as effective as it once was, there seems to be just this complete inability to drop it because of this political sensitivity.
And the difficulty in judging what the cost will be. So we've got the HS2 project that seems to have gone up now at about £100 billion, which will take a few minutes off a trip to Birmingham. Yeah. But now so much money has been spent, almost nobody, probably other than me, wants to cut it. What's the view of the Taxpayers Alliance?
Well, we'd like to scrap HS2 in full, but I think we're unfortunately past that point. And, you know, there are some projects which overrun in time and cost, but which actually, once they're completed, they seem to be worth it. The Elizabeth line, which stops just near the GB News studios, is perhaps one of them. But there are other projects which, you know, a few months in, a few years in, government should just be able to drop. And one of them is HS2. Another one might be the COVID lockdown.
Well, the COVID lockdown, we've now had a report yesterday saying that it didn't save that many lives and it certainly had a huge economic cost. The PPE is slightly different, though, isn't it? Because the cost of PPE rose because there was a shortage. That was straightforward supply and demand, and people thought it was needed. That was a quick fire cost rather than something that went over an extended period. Yes,
and inevitably, listen, there was going to be waste associated with the beginning of the COVID pandemic. That was absolutely inevitable. But what we're continuing to see, TPA research found just recently that £580,000 a day is still being spent on PPE storage. And given the amount of fraud there was in PPE, you know, the amount of faulty equipment that was purchased, it's clear that checks and balances weren't being used to the extent that they could have done.
And fraud is really serious. I took over from Lord Agnew, who was so good about trying to get the government to think about fraud and set up the government's internal fraud department to try and stop it. But that once money is spent, governments are much less good at seeing how it was spent than they are about arguing about what the budget will be in the first place. Is this something the TPA is regularly coming up against?
Yes, absolutely. Ministers change, civil servants change, and you then have a problem of accountability many years in the future. And I think we do need to look at mechanisms to ensure that the people that made decisions at the start have some level of accountability in the years going forward.
And if you were to be given dictatorial powers, what would you start cutting? You've got the HS2 to go with. Where would you go now?
Well, I think there are some benefits that need to be looked at. I think the triple lock is running to levels which is frankly unaffordable. There's some other benefits for example, the free TfL travel for the over 60s, which seems unsustainable. I think we do need to look again at the benefits system to ensure that it's properly encouraging work. HS2 is another one. I think there's a lot that the government could be looking at. Some of the woke projects, Arts Council, again, there's really a plentiful supply of waste and overspending on things that we simply cannot afford.
That the government could counsel, squeeze down, save the money on. But could it also, when it comes to spend money, do it more efficiently? Because the process of getting a project agreed is enormously bureaucratic. I was very impressed. There's a government body that does the large infrastructure projects, and the IPA. And I discussed with them how much the restoration and renewal of Palace of Westminster would cost. And in 5 minutes, this chap said to me it would be between 10 and 20 billion pounds. We then spent a couple of £100 million on the professional work to come up with a figure. And they came up with a figure of £14 billion, which was pretty much in the middle of the range that had been suggested by somebody after a few minutes' cogitation. Don't we need to be swifter at working through things and then making things happen?
I think if a government decides that project is going to go ahead, it needs to, go on full steam. But I mean, at the same time, it needs to ensure that there is a business case, there is an estimate that is serious, that is not done politically to get approval for a project that is seen as necessary for some political motivation. So I think it's about being really, really honest at the start and not saying, this is only going to cost a figure that we want it to cost, not what is realistic. And then once that figure is properly established and a business case is proven to have economic benefits, it's about ensuring that a certain degree of competence and continuity is implied to completing the project in the short to medium term.
And I hope the Taxpayers Alliance will always ensure that the term taxpayers' money is used rather than government spending, or even worse, investment, which is a Gordon Brown word to pretend that spending isn't what it is. Thank you very much for coming on, and to the Taxpayers Alliance for all its work.